Phyllis's next guests opened a window to World War II history that had not been known until the death of the celebrated fashion icon Emilio Pucci and his role in getting crucial information to Allied forces. What the New York Times called one of the most important historic documents of the Second World War. Terence Ward, known for his groundbreaking book on Iran, Searching for Hassan, and Terry's wife, Idanna Pucci, among her works, The Lady of Sing Sing. These two gifted writers tell the story of Emilio Pucci in a book Vogue magazine describes as a spy novel, calling the story stranger than fiction Emilio Pucci, the astonishing Odyssey of a fashion icon. These authors are not only celebrated writers, they are happily married and live in Italy.
You are watching Profondo TV with host Phyllis Haynes.
I noticed through all of your writing, not just this wonderful book about Emilio Pucci, but that you zero in on a single character often in your writing. Am I reading that correctly, that you are drawn to a certain kind of heroic behavior?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I personally am not going to spend a year or two of my life unless it's a heroic behavior, because this can be an example, and an example for posterity, for whoever reads the book. And also, I always hope that young people read what I write.
Yeah,
Terry,
you could also say that our world, depending on what glasses you wear, what focus you have, can either seem half full, half empty. It can either seem terribly dark, which perhaps some people may argue feels like that now. But it's far more important to write about, we think, people who have brought light into this world, people who have, even in the simplest of ways, have really shed light, have been inspired, have shed also wisdom. And quite frankly, of course, there are heroic figures in every family, in every walk of life, but there are times where their role really sings with a larger theme, whether it be a Caravaggio painting or whether it be this wonderful man that raised us as children in Iran, and one reflects now on everybody's safety over there. He left us with this glowing light that we've all carried in our lives, and these are not simple people; they're heroic figures. And in Idanna's case, she has a whole host of ancestors that sort of surfaced.
This reminds me of a quote by Emilio Pucci, which is rather amusing, and right. And he said, sometimes you may be sitting next to a very, very famous person, and you are so bored and you don't learn anything. But sometimes you sit beside a very simple person, a very modest looking person, and you learn so much.
And you leave with your heart full.
Yes. So this is a little bit our philosophy.
Yeah.
Well, that philosophy shows up in your book. It is one of the richest books I've read. Emilio Pucci, The Astonishing Odyssey of a Fashion Icon. I must be honest, I was skeptical because I don't follow fashion closely. But on the other hand, I know now more about World War II and the suffering in Italy than I ever knew before.
Mm.
And so let's start with what drew you to write this story. Idanna, obviously, you're related to Emilio Pucci, but what
Well,
made you decide on this story?
Mm.
well, not really, because one of the things I did write a lot about. Every book is about an ancestor, but when I'm researching, I forget completely that he's an ancestor or she's an ancestor, and this is the point. Now, it's not because Emilio Pucci was my uncle that I embarked on this. Absolutely not. The thing is that at one point, my aunt, his widow, was approached for a documentary. So we found the research very interesting, and we went on. And but we were not thinking of a book, and the documentary was never made. We just were so interested, and we were accumulating documents. um, uh, I found something really interesting in the New York Public Library that I had no idea. And then suddenly the breakthrough came. And Terry can tell you
Mm.
about this.
And the breakthrough was that we noticed in that self-published book, in the bibliography, a small
Like the
little
book that I
phrase,
found
the
in the library,
book that
this
Idanna
little,
had found,
yeah.
a small little phrase that said, report of Marchese Emilio Pucci and his role in the Ciano Diaries. Now, I hadn't seen that anywhere before, and it intrigued me because it also said CIA records.
Top secret.
And what we discovered later, after researching where this might be, it happened to be in the National Archives, but it had only been declassified after Emilio died in 1993, which meant that whatever he had written in this report, he never was able to see his entire life. It was labeled top secret and held by the US government all his life. Now, what was this? Well, to get our hands on it, we had to find the location. And you won't believe it, but the OSS files that relate to the espionage that America did in the Second World War, which predated the CIA, the OSS files are in the National Archives of Maryland. Well, the National Archives, if you go on the OSS files, are divided between 538 boxes. In each box, there are at least 50 to maybe 100 files, which means that to go through 538 boxes, not only do you need time and patience, but you also have to have a tremendous amount of focus because none of it is cataloged in any sense at all. It's as if you and I were to throw all these files up in the air and just pick them up and load them into a box. So, not by chronology, not
Can
by
I interrupt
subject.
you? You have to note that we were in Europe,
Yeah.
and we come across all these, the boxes,
Yeah.
and inside there were all these
The
documents, but
files. Yeah.
we had only possibility online of the
Yeah.
headings.
Yes.
So hundreds of headings,
Yes.
and
And let me give you an
yeah,
example of the headings. So here you are after days of going through quite a few of these headings in various boxes. You're on box 111 because you've gone through the entire amount once and never found it. So now you're going back again. And in box 111, you see about halfway in, you see hospitals in New Delhi. Then there's another file, gem dealers in West Africa. Then there's another file, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist. Then there's another file of werewolf Nazi spies in Syria. Werewolf meant that they were undercover. And then there it was, report of Marchese Emilio Pucci and his role with the Ciano Diaries. Because
Well,
52
let's
pages.
stop and take a
Yeah,
look for the audience.
yeah,
Let's start with the basics.
yes.
So I want to start with Idanna as 8-year-old Idanna looking at the scar.
Yeah, and I noticed the scar on his forehead, little bit back his forehead, and so I didn't make much of it, but it was a little bit strange. And so I just asked my father what it was. I mean,
Well,
exactly.
I asked you about that. I asked you about that because I thought it would bring us to the story of Emilio and the fact that he was tortured by the Gestapo.
Yes,
So
yes.
we love the
Mm,
fashion in this story, and we will. I want everyone to read this book because it's one of the. It's a thriller. So
mm,
let's tell me about
Well,
Emilio.
well, this report that we read,
mm.
there I discovered the real source of the scar, you
Yes.
see, and the fact that he was taken by the Gestapo, imprisoned, tortured, um, and you don't have. He was very. He wasn't. Um, he was a gentleman, at heart. So even in his description, um, I think it was much worse than what he described.
Like all young men in the war, when war comes and everyone has to be drafted, he had just returned from America, and when he returned on a long journey through Asia, by the way, coming back by sea, he had to join the military. Everybody did. There was a mass call up. And when he joined, he decided to join the Air Force, follow his younger brother, join the Air Force because, and you're going to be a little surprised to hear this, they, as Idanna's father once said, they thought it was the quickest and noblest way to die. No one thought that they were going to survive this war. Italy had been plunged, not because they wanted to, but because Mussolini was obsessed with the Germans, had plunged into this war on the side of the Germans. And probably 80% of the country didn't want to have anything to do with the Nazi leader, let alone the German Wehrmacht. But they found themselves all plunged in. Once he then studied to be a pilot or trained to be a pilot, he and his brother was sent off to Libya, which was the great battlefield where Mussolini had this idea of seizing the Suez Canal. And to do that, he had to go through British territory and British held Egypt. And then from there, he discovered that none of the pilots were being properly fed or even receiving funds from the government. And so much so that by the time he transferred over to
Well, they
Rhodes,
had these planes that,
yeah,
compared to the British, well, just made of canvas
some
practically.
of them were made of canvas and they're going up, so they're ill prepared. They're fighting against an enemy that has much more powerful weapons, and all of his colleagues are dying. I think he was in 3 or 4 different squadrons. Out of 18, only 2 survived. And then he would go to another squadron. They would all be wiped out. And so when he gets to Rhodes and he's flying out of Greece, in the Eastern Mediterranean as a torpedo bomber, uh, he takes it upon himself to take what in those days was methamphetamine. It was called Prevalin, and fly 20 hours a day because he couldn't bear the thought of married men going down and dying and leaving these families abandoned back home in Italy. He said, I'm a bachelor. Let me take their place. So, I mean, he was really heroic, very sacrificial, never boasted about any of this,
But
but that
also
was his life.
they had planes practically in canvas,
Yeah,
but what they had was an incredible courage
yeah,
and almost a, almost a passion for adventure,
yeah.
you know, for
Mm,
being adventurous.
mm,
So that the Air Force, the Italian Air Force, was known as the best in the world
yeah,
at that
yeah,
time.
yeah. The
It
best
was,
pilots, but the
the,
the equipment that was
yeah,
again not up to any speed, and as the war went on, and he saw how completely abandoned not only the army was, but also the military, the navy, the air force. One couldn't help but think about these fools, these monsters that had provoked this war and sent all these young kids into battle. Not only sent off 230,000 young farmers' sons into Russia in October wearing sandals.
yeah, no.
Almost none of them came back. So
But also, for
this,
instance, they had they he describes
mm,
how in Libya they ate the grass from the
yeah,
landing strip.
because they had no food.
They had no food, which was
or,
unthinkable.
or they wouldn't eat the food they were offered so they could send that meager sum of money back to their families. So he's witnessing this total fraud, this unbelievable collapse. And what happens in the story is this coming awareness of how betrayed the Italian people were. So for Emilio, like anybody who was born of a noble family, you followed the king's decision. The king had appointed Mussolini, so the king also could remove him, but the king had given his blessing. We follow the king. So,
It was called the Royal Air Force.
yeah, it was called the Royal Air
And
Force.
these aristocratic families,
Did it?
automatically followed the king, um, were part of the, aristocracy, therefore the monarchy and all that.
There was
But they
one.
were very brave.
There was one wonderful quote by a gentleman account who said, "We know we're going to lose this war, but let's lose it with some dignity. We know we're going to lose this war and we'll probably all die, but let's die with some integrity." So, imagine this being your destiny. And then of course he has this awakening of just deciding he's going to uh, go against not only Mussolini but Hitler, the entire apparatus.
when
And
they left from the station in Florence, the two
Yes.
brothers, my father became a pilot before Emilio, and Emilio became a pilot once he returned from America, where he had spent 2 years. He had started on a scholarship. He got a scholarship to study first in the University of Georgia, and then through a whole circumstances, a roller coaster, he ended up at Reed College. But when they were called to war, my grandfather couldn't even get himself to accompany them at the station in Florence. It was my grandmother who did it, because he couldn't bear the thought of his two young sons dying for the Germans,
Yeah.
going to
one
die.
of, one of the wonderful things, I shouldn't say wonderful, but the most insightful contrast that you build in the book, and I
Mm.
don't know if you did this intentionally, you weave through the whining and complaining
Mm.
from Mussolini,
Hmm.
contrasted with the
Hmm.
incredible resilience of
Yeah.
Emilio, who
Yeah.
suffered all kinds of illness throughout this endeavor. But
Yes.
Mussolini is, in every sense, a very weak man who's surrounded by yes men, in your words.
Yeah.
Say more about that.
Yeah, and he also, strangely enough, doesn't give a damn about any of these young men who are dying. You never once see any indication that he has 1 ounce of concern for all of the young men who've lost their lives heroically. And so that is something intentional because, in every megalomania, in every narcissist, leader, as we've come to realize with our own, you have this inability to have any compassion. In fact, his reaction when, say, 100,000 young men are taken prisoners of war or die in a battle, his reaction is, "I have to kick them harder. I have to kick them harder. They're not made to be Prussian soldiers. I have to beat them, beat them, beat them." I mean, this is something that's so painful to read while you realize so many young men are dying, and then you have, yeah, Emilio along with all the others doing their best, trying their best, but
There was
so
also
ill-led.
this real feeling of patriotism,
Yes.
and patriotism at the time. So there was this continuous conflict between patriotism and the absurdity of the whole thing.
I want to just make sure that we get the key point
Yeah,
that Emilio changes
yeah,
and saves some very important documents.
yeah.
Tell us about this part and how this turns the war. Tell us
Mhm,
about this act of heroism.
mhm.
Yeah, well, it says his role in the Ciano Diaries.
Mhm.
So we know they are diaries, which means they are daily, and Ciano is the name of the writer of these diaries. Now, he happened to be the foreign minister of Mussolini.
Mhm.
He happened also to be the husband of his daughter, Edda.
Of Mussolini's daughter, Edda Ciano.
Edda Mussolini Ciano. And he wrote these diaries that are written in a style that you and I could write, very easy to read, but it's a log, it's a daily log of what he, his meetings, who was at the meeting, what was being said. But generally, you see all the corruption and absurdity of the counterparts. His counterparts was Ribbentrop,
Yeah.
and you really enter into the heart of this alliance
Mm.
between Italy and Germany, and how
It was.
Italians were didn't Italians, the average Italian wasn't into this alliance at all,
And it
and telling
wasn't
him,
an alliance, it was a servile relationship. I mean, Hitler at the beginning at the beginning of his career adored Mussolini. That was his model. This man strutting around in the uniforms, militaristic. But the roles changed. And the Nazi leader, with all of this extraordinary military capabilities around him, organization and equipment, was able to have successes that Mussolini could only dream of. And Mussolini became his servant. He became a complete subject. And the people didn't know this. The Allies didn't know this. But in the diaries, you enter into this squalid relationship of the two and how Mussolini was being manipulated. Now, what the diaries are important
say
for.
about the New York Times. The New
Yes.
York Times
Called them the most important documents of the Second World War. And these diaries later on became they were used in the Nuremberg trials to convict the war criminals who had survived, including Ribbentrop, who was the foreign secretary, the colleague of Ciano, to convict them not that they could use the defense, oh, I simply followed orders, it was his fault, but rather that a war had been planned, had been mapped out, and was intentionally in the German plans for a year, 2 years in advance. And that is the basis of a war crime, the first war crime. And this is where international law is based.
And just so the
Immediate,
audience
yeah,
understands, Emilio Pucci was responsible for
yes,
getting these diaries into Switzerland
yes,
through Ada Ciano, and he
yes,
sewed these
mhm,
diaries into her clothing.
yes.
So I want to make sure that we get this.
Sewed it into her clothing.
Actually, he sewed it in one leg of a trousers.
Yeah.
He put them all in, he inserted them in, and then he sewed the ends, and then she wore this belt around her waist, so much so that they, when she passed they thought she was a pregnant woman, you see. And but yes, he had to put them in the hands of allies. In the meantime, Ciano had been accused of being a traitor, and he was in prison.
This is Eda's husband,
Yes,
Yes,
Ciano.
Ciano. He was in prison, ready to be executed,
yes,
actually, because he had helped to bring down Mussolini. Voted him out of office,
yeah.
and so one of his, if not the big thing before he died, he wanted these diaries to get into Allied hands, not to get into Hitler's hands. Hitler wanted these
Yeah.
diaries. Mussolini wanted his diaries.
Everyone was chasing both Ada and chasing Emilio to get these diaries. They didn't want the truth to come out. They were
Now, this
terrified.
I'm
Yeah.
going to stop you because I want people to read this book. I couldn't put it down. I know you hear people say that. I have read reviews of your book. I have, people who know me know that I've been interviewing authors for over 30 years,
Mm,
and never have I seen such extraordinary praise consistently
mm,
on this book. So we're going to stop right now and answer one last question, which is
mhm.
going to be hard because you got to stuff a whole lifetime into this. Tell us about Emilio's discovery when he made his first outfit on the
Mm.
ski slope, that picture that's on the cover of your book that shows the beginning of his career. How did he get discovered? And see if we can get this into a nutshell.
Well, first of all, he was a person incredibly positive, even in the worst circumstances. So he had a flair about life, a love of life, and he always looked forward. And in a way, he had that kind of capacity of placing himself always where luck could strike. So that picture is iconic, actually, because at one point, through other circumstances, he goes back to Zermatt, where he had been confined. He was 2 years in Switzerland, interned, and there he has this beautiful girl, woman, girlfriend. I don't know, girlfriend, not girlfriend, but anyway, she was, all her clothes were wet from the day before skiing, and so he sort of lent her his own trousers, which were very particular because he had been trained as an Olympic skier when he took this big decision not to go into the Olympics but to go to America with this scholarship. And so he had them made in Florence at a little seamstress, with a stirrup, so that while he skied, they wouldn't come out of the boot. So he lent her his trousers, which he had a little bit taken in that morning. At that time, you could find these seamstresses everywhere, somebody ready to sew. And then he lent her his own anorak, and he was tying her boots, when this photographer, Tony Frissell, made this picture. She was absolutely fascinated by the elegance of this couple, and particularly the elegance of this beautiful woman. And this picture, Tony Frissell was working for the Harper's Bazaar then. She had been a war photographer, but now she was with Harper. And so this picture ended up on the desk of Diana Vreeland, who was the editor then of Harper's Bazaar. And Diana Vreeland said, "Oh my God, this is gorgeous." And in America, there was not yet the whole idea that that you have to be chic on skis, And so she published this picture as on a page about a year later, so December 1947, and she published this picture together with two others, and it said an Italian design for skiing, And then she had him called she spoke to the Lord and Taylor buyer, who was this Mrs. Griswold that I met when I was working in America, in my early 20s, and they telephoned him, they called him, and he came to America, and that was the beginning of everything.
All by chance.
All by chance.
Well, thanks to his surviving quite an ordeal.
Yes.
And having this eye for color. I invite everyone to read this book, Emilio Pucci, The Astonishing Odyssey of a Fashion Icon, by Terence Ward and Idanna Pucci. I really do not miss the opportunity to read this amazing book. Thank you both for an extraordinary conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really.